So I want you to imagine returning from a really grueling month-long tour of Japan. And, we're talking about 1966 here.
Oh, yeah. Completely different world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't the pampered private jet luxury of modern arena tours. This is just exhausting, physically draining travel.
Like,
You're playing night after night through honestly totally inadequate sound systems to these deafening crowds. You are thoroughly jet lagged. Your internal clock is just shattered.
it's just running on fumes at that point.
Exactly. All you want is a moment of rest, a familiar routine, and maybe, I don't know, a brief celebration of the formula that has made you globally famous.
Sure.
But instead, you walk into a recording studio the very next day and you discover that the primary architect of your career has completely torn up your blueprint for success.
Yeah, he just threw it out the window.
Right. He doesn't want to build the familiar structures anymore. He has designed this labyrinth, basically, and he expects you to navigate it immediately.
And that visceral shock, that is the exact entry point into one of the most significant paradigm shifts in modern cultural history.
Definitely.
Because the touring musicians walking into that room are the Beach Boys. Specifically, we're talking about Like Love, Al Jardine, and Bruce Johnston.
And the architect waiting for them is, of course, Brian Wilson.
Right. And what we're exploring today is a really fascinating retrospective interview these surviving members recently gave to the Associated Press. It was to mark the 60th anniversary of Pet Sounds.
60 years, which is just, it's wild to think about.
It really is. But to understand the weight of this milestone, we kind of have to strip away 60 years of universal acclaim,
Yeah, we have to forget that we know it's a masterpiece.
Exactly. We have to look at this not as the inevitable creation of this legendary album, but as a moment of severe aesthetic and professional crisis for the people involved.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to really pull apart the historical, the psychological, and even the acoustic architecture of that specific crisis.
There's so much to dig into.
There really is. We are going to examine how a project that begins as this radical, confusing departure from a group's established identity, a project that was met with profound hesitation by the bandmates, right?
Oh, complete hesitation. And utter bewilderment by the corporate machinery at Capitol Records.
Exactly. We're going to look at how that gradually redefines the possibilities of recorded music.
Because for anyone who's, interested in the messy, often maddening reality of true innovation, this exploration really reveals that paradigm shifts rarely feel like magic in the moment.
They really don't.
They usually feel like a total loss of control.
Yeah. Which brings us right back to that studio in Los Angeles. The contrast between the returning touring band and the isolated visionary is just stark.
It's a tale of two completely different realities.
Right. While the physical embodiment of the Beach Boys was out in the world, executing this highly specific brand of carefree, sun-drenched pop, Brian Wilson had retreated.
He was just tucked away.
Yeah. And he was waiting for them, practically vibrating with this nervous intensity, constantly asking his inner circle, like, when are the guys coming home?
Because he'd been brewing an entirely different sonic universe in their absence. And the collision of those two worlds was just inevitable.
It really was. And the word the band members use in the AP interview to describe their reaction to this new music is mystified.
Mystified. That's such a great word for it.
It is. And frankly, we have to look at the cognitive dissonance they were experiencing there. This wasn't just a band being asked to, play in a slightly different key or try a new tempo.
No, not at all. The Beach Boys were a cultural institution built on a foundation of endless summer.
Right. Songs about surfing, cars, and untroubled youth. That was the brand.
Exactly. And the tracks Brian played for them, compositions like I Know There's an Answer, they were steeped in this really thoughtful melancholy.
Yeah, they were romantic, yes, but they possessed a profound psychological vulnerability.
And the band members themselves admit in the interview that while they appreciated romantic music, their core identity was supposed to be fun.
Fun. That was their whole thing. And that identity crisis is really the crux of the tension here. Brian was asking a group of young men who were globally recognized as, the avatars of joyful escapism,
Right.
to suddenly serve as the mouthpieces for complex internal sorrow and adult longing. He was subverting their brand from the inside out.
Which is incredibly risky. When an artist decides to force a highly successful commercial pop group to become the vehicle for personal soul-searching, The historical precedent usually points toward the dissolution of the band.
Or complete rejection by the label.
Exactly. It requires a tremendous amount of leverage to force that kind of pivot.
But, I want to challenge the idea of how that pivot actually happened, because the romanticized version of music history suggests that the band heard the genius of the new tracks and just immediately embraced the art.
Like they were struck by lightning and suddenly understood.
Right, exactly. But the interview reveals something much more pragmatic and, in a way, more impressive.
Yeah, it's very telling.
Despite the severe jet lag and the aesthetic mystification, they didn't walk out. They didn't stage a coup.
No, they didn't?
They note that they were, quote, professional guys. They were in the studio the very next day, standing behind microphones, sight-reading these incredibly complex, unfamiliar vocal arrangements.
It is a real testament to an elite level of professional discipline. I mean, they had to subordinate their own egos, their confusion, and their sheer exhaustion to serve a vision they didn't yet understand.
Yeah.
But to grasp why they deferred to Brian's authority, we have to examine the structural economics and the emotional history of the band leading up to 1966.
Definitely. Because Brian's isolation in the studio wasn't an accident. It was a heavily negotiated withdrawal from the machinery of touring.
Right. Let's pull that thread. The interview details a really pivotal moment that occurred prior to the Pet Sound sessions.
Yeah, Brian called up a band member who had actually stepped away to pursue his education.
Jardine.
Exactly. And Brian was desperate. He stated plainly that he could no longer survive on the road.
He just hit a wall.
He really did. The specific catalyst he cited was the intense toxic friction with his father, Murray Wilson, who had been acting as their manager.
Yeah, the environment was just destroying him.
So an arrangement was made. A substitute would step in for a while to give Brian a break.
Just a temporary fix, supposedly?
Right. But, of course, that temporary reprieve became a permanent fracture in the band's operational model. Brian never returned to the touring circuit.
And that operational fracture created one of the most fascinating economic and creative engines in the history of pop music.
How so?
Well, by removing himself from the grueling daily grind of live performance, Brian claimed the mental space and the physical time required to evolve.
Right.
The band members reflect on this arrangement in the interview as the best thing that could have happened because it allowed Brian to become an unfiltered outlet for his own soul. But we have to recognize the symbiotic relationship at play here. The physical body of the band, grinding it out in venues across Japan and Europe, playing the hits, was essentially acting as the venture capital that subsidized Brian's avant-garde laboratory back in California.
Wow. That is a brilliant way to frame it. The sweat equity of the touring musicians basically funded the architectural drafting in the studio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were buying him the time to be a genius.
And the interview notes that by the time Pet Sounds began taking shape, Brian's entire approach to composition had shifted.
He was no longer trying to write the next chapter of the surf narrative.
No, not at all. He had partnered with a lyricist, Tony Asher, to articulate a much more mature, insular perspective.
Right. And the era was changing. The broader musical landscape was shifting, particularly with what the Beatles were doing. But the core driver was really Brian's internal evolution.
But, recognizing an internal evolution and actually capturing it on magnetic tape are entirely different disciplines.
Oh, absolutely.
This is where the dynamic in the studio shifts from a collaborative family band into an environment characterized by absolute, almost authoritarian control.
Yeah, the vision was so specific, so deeply embedded in Brian's mind that he could not tolerate the slightest deviation from the sounds he was hearing internally.
Which brings us to one of the most striking, provocative descriptions in the entire AP interview. A bandmate refers to Brian during these sessions as the Stalin of the studio.
The Stalin of the studio. That is heavy.
We really need to unpack that because it totally shatters the myth of the laid-back California creative process.
It really does. Calling your collaborator a dictator, specifically using a historical figure synonymous with absolute uncompromising rule, it suggests an environment of immense pressure and relentless demand.
And the evidence of that pressure is just staggering. The interview highlights the vocal sessions for Wouldn't It Be Nice? Brian forced the group to record one specific microscopic section of vocal harmony more than 25 times.
25 times for one tiny section.
Yes. The singers would execute the take, believe they had achieved perfection, and tell Brian it sounded great, and Brian would flatly respond, "No, do it again."
And he wasn't being difficult just for the sake of asserting dominance. He was chasing an acoustic ghost.
Right. The band even had a nickname for his physiological capability. They called him dog ears.
dog ears because he could hear things no one else could.
Exactly. He could perceive microtonal frequencies, subtle phase cancellations, and harmonic textures that were completely invisible to the other human beings in the room.
It's like when a director can see colors that the painters literally cannot perceive. The process of painting becomes an exercise in blind obedience.
Yeah, that dynamic forces us to consider the philosophy of memory and the nature of creative trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, when you are standing in a studio exhausted on your 24th take of a single phrase, you are likely experiencing profound frustration.
Oh, maybe even deep resentment.
Right. The dictator moniker is earned in those grueling hours.
It is. Yet, when we hear the surviving members reflect on this 60 years later in the interview, the resentment has basically evaporated.
Yeah. The quote is, "It all worked out for the good."
It's amazing. Time acts as a purifying filter. When the result of that pain is universally recognized as a pinnacle of human vocal harmony, the memory of the friction is overwritten by an intense appreciation for the architecture.
That makes total sense.
The authoritarian demands are retroactively understood as necessary rigor.
And surviving that rigor requires a very specific mindset from the performers. Mike Love provides a perspective on this that completely upends the stereotypical narrative of a 1960s rock star.
Yeah, this part was fascinating.
When asked what he takes the most pride in regarding this era, he doesn't cite the fame, the money, or even the brilliant melodies.
No, he points to sobriety.
Exactly. He is fiercely proud that he did not succumb to the alcohol and drug culture that was so rampant at the time.
And the rationale behind that pride is highly instructive for anyone engaged in a collaborative enterprise.
Absolutely. He states that they needed to remain entirely clear and sharp to take the relentless direction and hit the exact, impossibly precise notes that Brian was assigning them.
It requires a tremendous amount of humility to realize that your role in a masterpiece is not to impose your own brilliant ideas, but to be a perfectly tuned, highly disciplined instrument for someone else's vision.
Right. By staying sober and sharp, he was ensuring that the vessel remained uncracked.
And that level of vocal precision was absolutely necessary because of what Brian was building underneath those voices.
The instrumental tracks.
Exactly. While the touring band was in Japan, Brian had been constructing the instrumental tracks using a cadre of elite Los Angeles session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew.
Legends.
Absolute legends. And the complexity of those tracks was unprecedented in pop music.
To truly understand the magnitude of the instrumental architecture, we have to look through the lens of Bruce Johnston.
His perspective in this AP interview is just invaluable.
It really is, because of his background. Before he was a Beach Boy, he was an A&R executive at Columbia Records.
Right.
He was classically trained. He explicitly notes that he was hired for his ears.
He wasn't just a pop singer. He possessed the technical vocabulary to decode exactly what Brian was attempting.
When Johnston walks into the Pet Sounds sessions, he is uniquely equipped to recognize that this is not standard pop production.
No. He mentions that he had already made 3 albums with the band in his first year, but upon hearing the tracks for Pet Sounds, he realized instantly that this was the definitive album of his life.
Yeah. His reaction is profound in its simplicity. He says he just shut up and did whatever Brian told him to do.
When a classically trained industry executive immediately submits to total artistic compliance, it really signals that the work happening in that room is operating on a fundamentally higher plane.
He actually uses an analogy to describe the sheer velocity of the innovation he was witnessing. He references the moment in Star Wars when the ship jumps to hyperspace.
Yeah, the sudden, overwhelming acceleration into a completely new dimension.
That was how it felt to hear these tracks. But, I want to dig into the actual mechanics of that hyperspace jump. What exactly was a classical ear like Johnston's hearing that completely defied the standard pop conventions of 1966?
Well, he was hearing the collision of high classical orchestration with the rhythmic drive of rock and roll.
Right.
Johnston points out that in the middle of a pop arrangement, songs like I'm Waiting for the Day or God Only Knows Brian was deploying string septets and quartets, French horns, and harpsichords.
Which was just not done.
Not at all. But the true genius wasn't just the instrumentation, it was the physics of the recording process itself.
Yeah, the interview touches on a vital concept of audio engineering that Johnston identifies as the missing ingredient in modern music. He calls it leakage.
Leakage.
I find this concept of leakage absolutely fascinating because in modern production terms, leakage is usually considered an error, right?
Yeah, it's a flaw you try to eliminate.
But Johnston frames it as the very soul of Pet Sounds. We need to break down exactly how this acoustic phenomenon works and why it makes this album impossible to replicate today.
Absolutely. To understand leakage, you have to look at modern recording methodology first.
Okay, let's contrast it.
Today, if you have an orchestra and a rock band, every instrument is meticulously isolated. The drummer is sealed in a soundproof booth, the strings are tracked in a separate room, or recorded one by one.
Right.
Every sound source is given its own pristine, sterile microphone feed, so the producer can manipulate them independently on a computer later. Complete control requires complete isolation.
But Brian didn't have unlimited tracks, and he didn't want isolation.
Precisely. Brian was operating in the physical spaces of the mid-1960s studios, primarily United Western Recorders.
Right.
He would pack 20 elite musicians into a relatively small room. Johnston actually compares it to shoving an orchestra into a phone booth.
A phone booth.
Yeah, so you have the legendary drummer Hal Blaine hitting his kit just feet away from a delicate string section and an upright bass.
Wow.
Because they are physically crammed together, the sound waves from the violins and the horns are literally bleeding or leaking into the microphones that are pointed at the drums.
So the acoustic energy is colliding in the air before the microphone even translates it to the tape.
Exactly. The physics of the room become the primary instrument.
That makes sense.
When sound waves from multiple instruments hit a single microphone at slightly different times, it creates minute phase shifts and harmonic blending that no digital plugin can authentically simulate.
It forces the instruments to interact.
Yes. The leakage creates a psychoacoustic ecosystem. It's a living, breathing wall of sound where you cannot surgically remove the bass from the piano because they have already merged in the physical atmosphere of the studio.
That is wild.
It requires the musicians to play with absolute dynamic sensitivity to each other, resulting in a unified organism of sound rather than a collection of isolated data points.
That is a staggering technical achievement. He is essentially weaponizing the limitations of 1960s recording technology to create a symphonic texture.
It really is brilliant.
But, creating a masterful acoustic ecosystem in a studio bubble is only half the battle.
Oh, right.
The music eventually has to leave the laboratory and enter the marketplace. And this brings us to the brutal collision between Brian's high art concept and the rigid commercial realities of the music industry in 1966.
The music industry at that time was not built to support or distribute complex, album-length artistic statements. The infrastructure was entirely designed around the 45 RPM single.
The interview outlines the standard operating procedure very clearly. The labels viewed albums mostly as an afterthought.
Right.
The goal was to manufacture a catchy 3-minute single, drive it to the top of the radio charts, and then quickly throw together an LP filled with B-sides and mediocre covers just to extract more money from the consumers while the single was hot.
The album was merely a delivery vehicle for the hit.
Exactly. Capitol Records had optimized their entire marketing, promotion, and distribution pipeline for this fast turnaround, single-driven model.
And the Beach Boys had been one of their most reliable assets in this system.
Until now. Because Brian completely rejected that paradigm for Pet Sounds, he wasn't interested in providing 2 hits and 10 filler tracks.
No.
He spent months painstakingly crafting a cohesive, thematic piece of art where the production value, the emotional tone, and the musical motifs maintained absolute continuity from the first second to the last.
We really have to pause and contextualize the immense risk of this strategy.
It was a massive risk.
Today, we expect artists to create thematic eras and cohesive concept albums. It is standard practice.
Right.
But in 1966, presenting a label with a dense, melancholy album that took half a year to record, heavily utilized classical musicians, and lacked an obvious upbeat surf pop single was commercial heresy.
The label's infrastructure simply could not process it.
And the initial response reflected that incompatibility. Capitol's promotional departments were entirely baffled.
They didn't know what to do with it.
They were handed a masterpiece that defied all the existing marketing categories. It wasn't surf rock. It wasn't a dance craze.
No.
It was an unprecedented hybrid of pop melody, classical orchestration, and profound emotional introspection. Because the label didn't understand how to sell it, the album initially struggled commercially in the United States.
The marketing minds were completely paralyzed by the innovation.
Paralyzed.
And this paralysis at the corporate level makes a story behind the album's title one of the most magnificent ironies in music history.
It's so funny.
You have this towering achievement of musical architecture, complex string arrangements, microtonal vocal harmonies, acoustic ecosystems, and Brian Wilson had absolutely no idea what to call it.
None.
He is sitting at his home in Bel Air, and his 2 dogs are barking at a passing train.
The dogs named Banana and Louie.
Banana and Louie. Someone in the room hears the dogs barking and suggests a double entendre. Why not call it pet sounds?
Right.
On one level, it means pet songs, as in your personal favorites. On a literal level, it references the actual audio of his dogs barking, which he ended up splicing into the end of the record.
Yeah, you can hear them on the album.
They take this suggestion to the baffled executives at Capitol Records, and that becomes the official title.
The juxtaposition is just brilliant. It grounds this incredibly high-minded, sophisticated art project in a charming, almost absurd domestic reality.
It really does.
It acts as a defense mechanism against pretension. Brian wasn't posturing as the classical maestro. He was just a guy in his house, listening to his dogs, trying to externalize the beautiful, complicated sounds in his head.
Yeah. The humility of that title stands in sharp contrast to the aggressive marketing we usually see when an artist attempts to pivot to serious art.
Definitely.
And that total lack of visual or thematic pretension leads perfectly into a fascinating cultural clash regarding how the album was packaged and how it was perceived by their peers.
Oh, this is a great story.
The interview shares a surreal anecdote that perfectly encapsulates this. Sometime later, Mike Love travels to India to study transcendental meditation at the Maharishi's ashram. And who is he hanging out with? Paul McCartney.
The intersection of two musical titans at the peak of their influence.
Exactly. And McCartney, who had been profoundly influenced by Pet Sounds, turns to Mike Love and delivers a very specific critique. He says, Mike, you really ought to take more care with your album covers.
We have to analyze the source of that critique to understand its weight.
Let's do it.
McCartney was the driving conceptual force behind the Beatles' SG-8 Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That album is universally recognized as a watershed moment, not just for its music, but for its packaging.
Right.
The cover is a high-concept, culturally dense, expensive piece of pop art that perfectly telegraphs the ambition and the psychedelic complexity of the vinyl inside.
Yeah, it's iconic.
McCartney understood that in the evolving landscape of the late 60s, the visual presentation was a crucial component of the artistic statement.
And what was the visual presentation for Pet Sounds? An album of equal, if not greater, musical ambition? It was a photograph of the band standing in the San Diego petting zoo feeding a group of goats.
Just feeding some goats?
It is painfully pedestrian. There is no high art concept. There is no psychedelic signaling. It looks exactly like a band fulfilling a tedious promotional obligation on a Tuesday afternoon.
Which is exactly what it was.
Right.
But how the band defends this choice reveals a fundamental philosophical difference between the Beach Boys and their British contemporaries. Mike Love's response to McCartney is a masterclass in musical confidence.
It really is. The quote from the interview is definitive. Love told McCartney, "We always felt what was most important was what went in the sleeve, not the exterior."
That is a profound statement of artistic priority.
Yeah.
They refused to rely on visual signifiers to convince the audience that they were consuming high art. They believed the architecture of the sound had to speak entirely for itself.
Exactly.
If the music was truly groundbreaking, it didn't matter if the cover featured goats at a petting zoo. The work within the grooves of the vinyl was the only thing that carried lasting value.
And while that philosophy may have confused the marketing department at Capitol and the mainstream American consumer initially, it did not confuse the target audience that actually mattered in the long run.
Their peers.
Their peers. The interview makes it abundantly clear that when other musicians, the people who actually understood song structure, arrangement, and harmony heard Pet Sounds, it triggered an invisible revolution.
It was an education for the elite.
Yeah.
Musicians possess a different listening vocabulary than the general public. When they heard the acoustic leakage, the diminished chords, the use of electro-theremins and bicycle bells woven seamlessly into pop melodies, they immediately recognized the structural subversion.
It shattered their preconceived boundaries of what a pop record could achieve.
Exactly. The impact of Pet Sounds wasn't initially measured in massive sales. It was measured by the frantic attempts of every major songwriter to elevate their own craft to meet the new standard Brian Wilson had just established.
It is the ultimate example of an artist's artist.
Yeah.
You create a piece of work that might fly over the heads of the masses, but it fundamentally rewrites the DNA of the creators who will eventually capture the masses.
All said.
We've tracked this journey from the exhaustion of a jet-lagged studio session through the dictatorial pursuit of perfection, the physics of acoustic leakage, the corporate confusion, and the silent revolution among musical peers. Now we must turn our attention to the long tail of legacy.
Yes.
Because the interview we're examining was conducted to mark a 60-year anniversary. And you have to remember, this is an interview taking place after Brian Wilson's passing. So the surviving members are not just looking back at the album, they're looking back at their friend.
That changes the entire tenor of the conversation, doesn't it?
It really does. It adds this layer of, I don't know, almost a protective nostalgia. How they remember Brian is just as important as how they remember the music.
And their recollections actually differ in really interesting ways. I mean, Bruce Johnston remembers the absolute musical genius, the technical mastery that made him just shut up and listen.
Right.
Mike Love focuses a lot on the discipline, the rigor, and, his own role in staying sober to execute that vision. And Jardine often reflects on the personal dynamic, the brotherly connection, and the toll it took on Brian.
It shows that public history and private friendship are two very different things.
Oh, absolutely. They carry pieces of Brian's legacy that no historian can fully access. We can analyze the sheet music all day, but they were the ones in the room feeling the air shift when he changed a chord progression.
And a timeline of 60 years borders on the incomprehensible within the disposable framework of pop culture.
Totally.
The band members acknowledge the sheer absurdity of it. They admit that if you had approached them 61 years ago, in the midst of those grueling 25-take sessions, and told them they would still be answering questions about this specific arrangement of songs 6 decades later, it would have seemed entirely illogical.
It was unachievable in their minds.
Yet, here they are.
This milestone provides a vital lens on the philosophy of memory and how artists metabolize their own history. Earlier, we discussed the friction, the Stalin of the studio, the relentless demands, the exhaustion.
Right.
But when the interviewer asks them how they perceive the album today, whether they hear the genius, the youth, or the suffocating pressure of those months, their answer strips away all the historical baggage.
It's incredibly pure. They respond that they simply hear a beautiful album with great performances.
It speaks to the permanence of art versus the impermanence of the struggle required to create it.
Yeah.
The 3 to 6 months of maddening studio sessions, the panic of the record label, the aesthetic confusion of the touring band, all of that is temporary. It evaporates.
Right. What remains, crystallized on magnetic tape, is the beauty they managed to capture.
Time distills the trauma of creation into pure appreciation for the result. The friction was the necessary heat to forge the glass. But you don't look at a beautiful stained glass window and think about the furnace. You just look at the light shining through it.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And, how they interact with that light today brings up a crucial distinction the band makes about the nature of their legacy.
They clearly demarcate the experience of recording the album from the experience of performing it.
They really do. They emphasize that recording Pet Sounds was incredibly hard work. It was an intellectual and physical grind. But taking that music out into the world and performing it live is the ultimate reward.
That is the engine keeping them on the road in their 80s.
And we also have to mention that Brian himself eventually took this music on the road decades later with the Brian Wilson Band.
Yes, which was a monumental event. For decades, Pet Sounds was considered impossible to reproduce on stage.
Because of all that acoustic leakage and the Wrecking Crew instrumentation we talked about.
Exactly. It was a studio-only creation. But when Brian finally performed it live in the early 2000s, it completely changed the public understanding of the album.
It did. It showed that the emotional core of the songs, the vulnerability, the youth, the longing, could translate to a live audience. Hearing an older Brian revisit those themes of youth and hope later in life was just emotionally devastating in the best way.
It brought the whole thing full circle. They endure the travel and the physical toll of touring because the live performance completes the circuit.
Right.
You can build a masterpiece in the absolute isolation of a studio. You can engineer the perfect acoustic ecosystem with 20 musicians in a room. But if the music never leaves that vacuum, it remains an abstract achievement.
Exactly.
The true emotional payoff, the sustenance that fuels an artist for 60 years, is the tangible, real-time feedback of witnessing your creation interact with the nervous system of another human being.
It is the transition from isolation to total connection. They spent months singing into cold microphones under the scrutiny of an exacting visionary. But today, they get to stand on a stage and watch the emotional resonance of that hard work wash over an audience.
If we synthesize this entire journey, it presents a beautiful, challenging paradox about the nature of creation and human connection.
Let's hear it.
The vocal harmonies on Pet Sounds are universally celebrated as some of the most seamlessly blended, empathetic, and emotionally unified sounds ever committed to tape.
They're the sonic embodiment of togetherness.
Yet, as the history reveals, those harmonies were forged through profound separation.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Brian Wilson had to physically isolate himself from his bandmates, retreating into the sanctuary of his own mind to conceive the architecture. The band was touring the globe, disconnected from the creative process, until they were pulled into the intense, highly controlled environment of the studio.
So the ultimate expression of harmony was born from absolute fragmentation.
Exactly. It suggests that sometimes the most profound and unified connection you can ultimately offer to the world requires you to first step entirely away from it.
Right. To shut out the noise, reject the established formulas, endure the friction of bringing your internal vision into reality, and trust the acoustic leakage of your own instincts.
Exactly.
For everyone listening, you don't always need to follow the blueprint. Sometimes you just have to trust the sounds you hear in the isolation of your own mind, even if the world isn't quite ready for them yet.
A great takeaway.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical sources, the psychology, and the acoustics of a true cultural masterpiece. Keep exploring the history behind the art, keep questioning the formulas, and whatever you do, keep listening closely to the complex architecture of the world around you. We'll catch you next time.